possessive spouse, it doesn't necessarily mean they're a villain. Yes. It could be someone who genuinely loves their spouse or partner, but they're just going the wrong way they're going the wrong way about it in terms of showing and operating that relationship. So it could be someone who is not necessarily a bad person. It's someone who is operating in such a way that the other person is finding their love very overwhelming, that they're finding it difficult to breathe inside that relationship. The possessive spouse does not experiencing themselves that they are controlling. They experience that they are devoted, they are caring, they are more invested in that relationship and very attentive and very committed. What they cannot see, that what they call love, the other person probably is calling suffocation. We continue with our series talking about the different archetypes that are in existence for human beings in terms of whichever behavior you can see, you can fit it into a certain archetype. And we're talking about personalities within marriage. And we spoke about the invisible spouse, the person who disappears in a marriage. They enter as a full human being, and then over a period of time, they constantly are pleasing their spouse, and they're constantly accommodating, becoming their own sort of desires, their own opinions, their own sort of ambitions become subservient. And over a period of time, maybe not dramatically, but gradually, incrementally, their identity erodes, and ultimately they disappear in that relationship, where they no longer have a voice, they no longer have an influence, and they are just basically cruising along in that relationship. And that's not to say that they are unhappy. Maybe they're happy with that arrangement. But we're just telling you the different archetypes that exist. And there's also different opposites of that as well. But let's quickly wrap up the invisible spouse. What is it? Which operating force is sort of dominating here? It's actually the ego, but it's in a defensive mode where self-expression feels too costly, so the system shuts it down. We all have a heart which signals to you what the true path is, what the true rightful action is, but the heart in this instant keeps signaling that this is not right, you are losing yourself, but it gets overridden every time. The spirit, which is constantly yearning for meaning and purpose, disappears first. The ambitions, the hobbies, the things that were specifically that particular spouse's, all surrendered. The mind is also in operation, but it justifies every accommodation, every surrender. Oh, this is what just mature relationships require. I'm being a good spouse. The body is the one that's reporting and showing the cost, the exhaustion, the flatness, the low ceiling on joy, but nobody is listening to it. And even many extreme cases, you may have a spouse who is very miserable, living in depression. And in the external influence dynamic, the relationship itself rewards every accommodation and makes visibility feel dangerous. It turns the wrong volumes up and turns the right volume down. So this is the invisible spouse, which is constantly defending its actions. And the opposite of that is what we are going to discuss today. Of the same sort of power dynamics in a relationship, you have the possessive spouse. Maybe they exist in the same relationship. On the one hand, you have the invisible spouse, on the other hand, you have the possessive, the most dominant spouse. And let's dissect and deconstruct this particular archetype of the possessive spouse. We all know, maybe you're in a relationship, maybe you are a possessive spouse yourself. And if you're not in that relationship, maybe you know someone who is a possessive spouse, because we can all identify them. We can all see them around us. And we've heard about them. Maybe somebody close to you has confided in you that their spouse is very controlling and very possessive. So let's understand this in a little bit more detail about what this particular archetype is and what are the hidden forces which are in operation. So where there is an invisible spouse, there's also going to be a possessive spouse. So let's look at the forces that operate underneath into how a possessive spouse operates. And one thing I want to clearly mention, just because someone is a possessive spouse, it doesn't necessarily mean they're a villain. Yes. It could be someone who genuinely loves their spouse or partner, but they're just going the wrong way they're going the wrong way about it in terms of showing and operating that relationship. So it could be someone who is not necessarily a bad person. It's someone who is operating in such a way that the other person is finding their love very overwhelming, that they're finding it difficult to breathe inside that relationship. The possessive spouse does not experiencing themselves that they are controlling. They experience that they are devoted, they are caring, they are more invested in that relationship and very attentive and very committed. What this one person finds or calls love, the other one finds this as suffocation. Let's put this into the context of a real life scenario. Imagine a couple, Daniel in his 30s, he's married to someone he loves, he's devoted to his wife, he would do anything for her. But from the very first year of the marriage, a certain pattern involved where he needed to know where she was at all times. Not occasionally, but always. If he sent her a text and he was unanswered for an hour, it produced a certain anxiety that did not resolve until he heard from her. He was always uncomfortable with her friendships, particularly with male friendships. Nothing had ever happened, but nothing was even going to happen. But that possibility that something may happen, the mere existence of other men in her life, produced something in him he could not name or control. He never forbade anything, but he was not aggressive or threatening either. He just asked questions, expressed concerns, got quiet in a way that was somehow louder than anger. And over time, without anyone deciding this was a plan, his wife was constantly reporting to him where she's going, giving him updates every hour, who she's meeting. And it was like she was walking on eggshells. Her world got smaller and smaller because he, through his anxiety, caused those friendships to disappear simply because the friendships became less and less frequent, and ultimately those friends dissipated from the wife's life and she had fewer and fewer friends. It was easier to have those fewer friends than to manage the conflict, the discomfort that came with having that circle of friends for the wife. The independence became less visible, easier than the atmosphere it created. She started to feel, and she could not have explained this to anyone, like she was living inside a very comfortable, very loving, very slowly shrinking space. And he genuinely had no idea that he was actually causing this to her, because from inside his operating system, he was not controlling her. He was terrified of losing her. It was his own insecurity or inadequacy which was fueling this feeling, and he never had learned to tell the difference. So that distinction between love and the fear of loss dressed as love is what this episode is really about, is how we distinguish the tyrant in a relationship who is violent, who is an abuser, a domestic abuser, compared to someone who doesn't exercise any violence but is just possessive. There's a big difference, there's a distinction, and this is that distinction. And maybe both couples don't even realize that these sort of patterns are in operation, and this is the end consequence that they are leading towards. And what I want to do is name the specific behaviors so you can recognize these patterns precisely, either in your own life or in the people that you know. So this constant checking, needing to know where the partner is at all times, is not for a practical necessity. Sometimes people need to know, for argument's sake, if your spouse has gone on a long journey, they're going on the motorway, you want to make sure they've reached there safely, they haven't broken down. That's understandable. That's just being practical. But if you know she's gone to the local shop and it's only 10 minutes when you're constantly texting them, where are you? What time are you back? Then that is possessiveness. And that anxiety does not resolve regardless of how much reassurance is given. The reassurance never sticks. An hour later, the anxiety is back. And this constant checking becomes a loop that Daniel, or somebody like Daniel, gets involved in. So this discomfort with independence and the friendships that create unease, particularly with anyone who could be a threat, is what the problem is for the possessive spouse. It doesn't even have to be a real threat, it's just a perceived threat. And over time, the partner stops mentioning certain friendships. It's easier than watching the spouse become agitated and slowly to let go of those friendships. So this is, again, jealousy dressed as devotion. Oh, I love you so much, I cannot stand the thought of losing you. Sounds like romance, feels like romance, but it's experienced over time as a heaviness that the other partner cannot put down. Becomes a burdensome, because a devotion is real, but is the devotion of someone gripping rather than someone giving. So this is different ways that this possessive spouse expresses themselves. Nobody decides to shrink the partner's world, it just happens. So the possessive spouse doesn't say to their wife or the other spouse that you need to let go of these friendships, don't go out, cut your links with this person, but they create an environment where the other person, the other spouse, knows that they need to navigate around that in order to accommodate and in order to bring peace into the household. And this accommodation, again and again, answering those questions again and again over a period of time, incrementally, over the years, months and years, it becomes an issue where the spouse who is being controlled ends up living in a very shrinked world where they are just living in a small bubble which has been, or a prison which has been created inadvertently by the possessive spouse. And maybe by the time they realize that they have been caged in this prison with invisible bars, it's too late. Let's analyze the operating system that is in operation here, of the human operating system in this particular behavior. All the different forces that we've discussed in all these previous episodes, you'd be surprised again, or maybe not. It's the ego in operation here as a dominant force. The ego is in a defensive mode, but this is a different kind of defense. This is where the person is defending attachment, defending that relationship itself. They've identified this relationship as a primary source of safety and meaning for them. And they will do whatever it is necessary to protect that source from threat, whether it's real or imagined. The heart is also present here, but it's distorted. The love is genuine, the heart is genuinely engaged, but the heart signal has been filtered through so much fear that it's become distorted. And what comes out is not love expressed as generosity and freedom. It is love expressed as an obsession. I mean, the example I can give you on this is we hear so many stories when somebody claims that they are in love with someone. They've devoted themselves, they're committed to somebody, but if that other person refuses their advances, or that particular suffocation disguised as love, they walk away or they end up going with somebody else, and this possessive person cannot tolerate that. They will end up sometimes killing the very same person that they claim to love. And history is littered with so many examples, even to this modern day. just because it happens so commonly, then we know people who, even in our localities, people that we've known, that this has happened to, that someone says, if you can't be mine, then you can't be anybody else's. So where is the love then? Where is the heart's genuine desire for love? It's not love, it's obsession, it's possessiveness. And this is where the ego comes in as a dominant force. And the ego says, if you can't be mine, then you can't be anybody else's. And then the mind obviously is a strong force in operation, but the mind is recruited in service of that particular fear. Every concern gets rationalized. I'm just being attentive. I just care deeply. Any reasonable people, but like any reasonable person would behave like this. The mind builds a case for why the controlling behavior is actually evidence of how much they care. The spirit is absent. The possessive spouse has collapsed their entire sense of meaning and purpose into that relationship. Whereas the spirit's job is to give you a purpose and meaning which is far bigger and vast beyond your own self. So if you have made a relationship as your main focus, purpose, and that gives you meaning, then know for a fact that your purpose of life has become distorted, and you now run the risk of becoming disappointed, and you are going to end up either harming yourself or harming the person that you're claiming to love and you're trying to possess, even though it can many times be inadvertent through your behavior. So when the relationship is the only source of that purpose, the terror of losing it becomes unbearable, which is why the grip tightens over time rather than it relaxing. And this is why, if in many cases, when there's a couple divorce or they split, maybe one of them goes into some sort of a perpetual depression, and which they are unable to snap out of it just because that relationship is broken down. If they had a bigger, higher purpose than the relationship, then they would not have fallen into that depression. And there's always this one like aspect of this relationship, and the possessive aspect of it, that almost majority of the time it can end, because the ultimate end is that the relationship will break down, or the spouse that is being controlled will end up becoming invisible in that relationship. And in all these cases, you have to ask yourself, is this leading to a healthy relationship? No, it's not. Maybe the person that you claim to love becomes so resentful of you that they end up hating you, and they cannot see themselves like coming out of that relationship. They may end up staying in that relationship, but they stay without choice. And maybe it's the children, maybe it's finances, but the relationship is no longer a healthy, loving relationship. So the lesson in all this is that where a relationship is based on this fragile ego, where one spouse is controlling the other, then ultimately you are going to be a loser. I just want to say a final few words about what true love should be like in a relationship, rather than this current system of one being possessive and the other one slowly shrinking away and disappearing and becoming the invisible spouse. Because love in a relationship should be such that you love the other person for who they are, not because you love them how they make you feel. You love them because you need to cling on to them for how they are sort of boosting your ego. Maybe you have a beautiful trophy wife, you need to hold on to her because it boosts your ego. Or you're a spouse which is making holding on to the other because for financial reasons, because they give you security and safety. Real love emanates from loving the other person for who they are, and both parties giving and receiving, not operating a dynamic where one is controlling or constantly taking and the other is constantly giving. It may work temporarily, but ultimately it's like a vehicle that's going to break down. And in that breakdown, you are talking about people's lives and mental welfare, which is at stake. It's not a case of, oh, the car's broken down, we'll just get another vehicle and keep on moving. Real human beings are involved here. And once you affect somebody's mental well-being, then it makes it very difficult to be able to repair that person and rebuild that relationship to back to a healthy state.